professionals don't only care for people with physical ailments, we also have a responsibility to look after psychological and mental health as well. There's an increase in depression and suicides in rural communities, and I'm concerned about the effects of the fossil fuel industry on farming, particularly the loss of vital farmlands to coal seam gas, to the impact on water, to the impact on communities of fly-in, fly-out workers. All of these add to the stresses that farmers face every day. So has there been any investigation into the effects of coal seam gas on rural health and mental health?
And probably one of the best people that might answer that question is here today, Dr. Methuen Morgan. And I'd like to introduce him now. Many of you have heard about him. He is a respected academic in the field of environmental psychology. He lectures at the University of New England, but in addition, he is a farmer from Chinchilla with a background, with a family business in a feedlot business. And so he comes to you not only with his academic background, also with his clinical expertise, but furthermore, he actually comes from the affected area and has a myriad of family and friend connections and business connections that he draws upon. So thank you very, very much, Methuen.
Lovely, thank you very much. I too would like to thank the organisers for the invitation to speak today. I have a reputation for being hopeless with technology, so this could go pear-shaped at any moment. I'd like to also thank the traditional owners for the invitation and for the welcome to country. Before I start, I just need to make a couple of minor disclosures. Firstly, I currently am not a full-time academic. I casually lecture at the University of New England, particularly in the area of behaviour change and environmental psychology, as has been mentioned. My full-time job is actually, I build solar farms for a living, and commercial solar farms in particular. So there's a potential for some sort of conflict in that space. That having been said, when I undertook the research that I want to talk about today, I was in fact a full-time student and have a small property just outside of Armidale. My fellow authors, I just would like to mention that Don Hine, who was my supervisor, and Navjot Bulla are researchers. We did have some clinicians on the team, Professor Deborah Dunstan and Dr. Warren Bartik, so it wasn't just a case of researchers, academic researchers amusing themselves. We actually had some experts analysing and going through the data with us. So the aim of the research that I want to present in the paper that is published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology under the title Fracked Coal Seam Gas Extraction and Farmers' Mental Health was to investigate and to understand farmers' perceptions of and responses to the rapid expansion of the coal seam gas industry within rural areas. Let me see if I can make this work now. Oh, here we go. There's a saying that you'll need a doctor maybe once or twice a year and hopefully a lawyer less, but you'll actually need a farmer 3 times a day. Farmers enable other professions to go about their business rather than having to be hunters and gatherers. That is, of course, unless you're in a Harry Potter movie, in which case the question about farmers becomes entirely redundant. The complete agricultural sector, including farmers and directly associated downstream processing and service industries, accounts for about 13% of the GDP. In comparison, the mining sector in total accounts for 7%. There are many threats to the viability of agriculture. Many farmers would probably put commodity prices and rural debt at the top of their list. But a number of farmers are beginning to acknowledge the salience and the magnitude of the threat posed by climate change. Approximately 32 gigatons of CO2 per year, or 78% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, comes from fossil fuel combustion and industrial activity. Of this, around about 12 to 15% comes from the farming sector. While demand for energy is increasing, there is growing acknowledgement of the need to shift our energy sources to those with a reduced carbon footprint. In this lecture, I've just come from lecturing 102, my apologies. A difficult task, it was statistics. In this talk, I wanted to basically look at farming stresses, attend to is coal seam gas a stressor, how those stresses ended up ranking in our study. I want to tease out then what we did with some of the data and information, which was to generate some stress profiles, and I'll talk about that in a moment, to look at the impact of engagement status on those stress profiles, and then talk to some of the mental health outcomes that we found in our study. Okay. The purpose of the research, as I say, was to understand the perception of farmers to the CSG industry, in particular the likely outcome to the industry and in respect of their families, properties, communities, and the environment more generally. We were also interested in the responses to the seemingly unstoppable advance of this extractive industry. So how did it affect mental health, and what actions were the farmers themselves taking to stop it? We examined the contribution of coal seam gas extraction to the global stress burden and the mental health of 378 Australian farmers. The farmers are currently being exposed to a unique range of vocational stresses, and while mental health morbidity is similar to their non-rural counterparts, suicide rates are in fact high. So farmers, as I said, experience a very unique range of vocational stresses, and at the top of them obviously is debt, time, bureaucracy, isolation, farming hazards, and weather. But before I start, I want to offer a couple of brief definitions to get us on the same page, if I may. Stress may well be defined as the confusion created when the mind overrides the body's basic desire to choke the living shit out of some arsehole who desperately needs it. However, that's probably not very helpful when it comes to a scientific paper. So what I want to do then is discuss what is probably more acceptable, which is the fact that the unanimous agreement on the conceptual definition of stress has been rather elusive across the range of stress research domains. Stress is predominantly conceptualised as either a stimulus or a response. As a stimulus, stress refers to environmental events such as natural or man-made disasters, retrenchment, severe illness and the like. These things would normatively be assessed as being stressful, while as a response, stress refers to the physiological outcome within the individual, so how we feel, if you will. Despite an event or an object being considered normatively stressful, individual perceptions may result in varying assessments of the degree to which that event or object is assessed as being stressful. So for the purposes then of this discussion, I'll be referring to the stimulus, so try that again, I will be referring to the stimulus or the event as the stressor and the response as stress. So let's bore you to death now with some statistics and some demographics. The sample comprised of 378 farmers, of which 172 were male and 169 were female. This is a little unique given that the ABS considers that 78% of the farming population is male, and so the fact that we had a 50-50 split was both interesting and a little unusual. We also asked about 4 CSG engagement states. 155 or 41% of our farmers indicated that a coal seam gas lease existed on their property, but they had not yet been approached. Only 34 or 9% had been approached by coal seam gas operators and had rejected the offers that had been made to them. 64 or 17% indicated they had negotiated an outcome or would soon commence negotiations, and 125 or 33% believed that, to the best of their knowledge, no lease existed over their property. For this study, we employed the Edinburgh Farming Stress Inventory and the DAS-21, which is a measure of depression, anxiety and stress. The original scale, the Edinburgh Farming Stress Inventory, had 6 primary stress domains. They were bureaucracy, finance, isolation, weather, farm hazards and time pressure. We added 11 further items to address the concerns about coal seam gas. Essentially, we found much the same in our sample. When we did some statistical analysis on the results, we ended up with the same domains. However, with the exploratory factor analysis, we did the finance split into 2 distinct constructs, a structural and a trading financial construct, and coal seam gas also behaved in a rather unexpected way, which we'll talk about in a moment. So, do farmers believe coal seam gas to be a unique farm stressor? And the answer is no, they don't. They actually consider it to be 2 very unique stressors. And they were very distinct. There was an on-farm stressor and there was an off-farm stressor. So let me just tease those out, if I may, for a moment. The on-farm stressor, the items related to worrying about the children's future, a reduction in property values, the off-farm, degradation to the environment, threats to human health and deteriorating community standards. And the on-farm stressor, obviously, as it says there, was relating to the negative impact on farm activities, a loss of privacy, impacts on profitability, and having to deal with coal seam gas staff. Okay, so which of the stresses was perceived to be the most stressful? Again, our analysis, we sort of punch all this information into a computer and the little computer bugs run away and do their thing. And we were trying to see which of the stresses was the most stressful, if you will. And intriguingly, off-farm coal seam gas was in fact the most stressful of all of the stresses we had. Economic viability came in a very close second, and weather also was third. That box in the top left-hand corner, all of those stresses were significantly higher than the other stresses in the box to the right. So time pressures, bureaucracy and operational debt were grouped as a group of stresses of the same magnitude, if you will, but they were significantly less than the other 3. And so we go down the list. As it says there, on-farm coal seam gas and farm hazards, with social isolation being the least stressful. So does coal seam gas contribute to negative mental health outcomes? We wanted to see if coal seam gas was a unique stress domain and did it impact. So we ran 3 multiple regressions, because that's what you do when you're a researcher. You have no life, you only look like a human, it's not real. You run multiple regressions just for fun. The first model explained about 19% of the variance in depression. The isolation construct explained the most at 13% unique variance, while off-farm coal seam gas construct explained 1% of the unique variance. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is in fact, to interpret that in English, that the off-farm coal seam gas significantly contributes to depression in this sample. So it is in fact a unique contributor to depression. The second model, literally, we found that isolation, economic viability contributed to the unique variance where none of the other variables did. And finally, the third one, our model explained approximately 28% of the variance of stress or stress reactivity. Again, time features was 6% of the unique variance, isolation 4%. But the coal seam gas construct explained 3% of unique variance in, and that was off-farm coal seam gas in stress reactivity. So off-farm concerns were a significant contributor to depression and stress reactivity. Through a process called latent profile analysis, which again I'm sure you're all intrigued to learn more about later after this, we identified 4 very distinct stress profiles. Starting from the left-hand side, we have our non-stressed or unstressed profile. Moving across, we have an sorry, let me go back a bit. The unstressed profile, literally what we're doing is comparing, we asked the program to group participants according to their responses on our items. So the program spat out these 4 very distinct profiles. Unstressed farmers are very relaxed about everything. In fact, they're so relaxed as to be hardly upright. The next group was our finance stress. These farmers were unstressed by most things, but they were stressed. They had some financial issues with regards to trading, debt, whatever. They were essentially stressed by financial concerns. The third group, working across from the left, is probably what I think is the most interesting of the groups. This was our coal seam gas stress group of farmers, and there were 58 participants in that group. These people are very similar to the non-stress group, and essentially they're unstressed by any of the conventional farm stresses. However, they're highly stressed by coal seam gas, and we will see that they have significantly higher levels of depression and stress reactivity compared to the non-stress groups later on. Our final group of farmers are stressed by everything. They are what we call globally stressed. And a quick scan through the individuals in this group, we saw some scores that were on the 3 mental health measures that were frankly very alarming. Okay. We then decided to see whether engagement with the industry contributed to mental health outcomes. To do this, we split our sample into 4 groups. The first group was no lease, so these were the farmers that had no lease over their property, or thought they had no lease over their property at least. The second group was the farmers who had a lease, but as yet no approach had been made by the CSG companies. The third group, an approach had been made but was rejected by the farmers. And finally, there were those that were engaged with CSG operators, either in production or in negotiation with the coal seam gas operators. And here's another riveting slide. This one should send you to sleep if nothing else does. Essentially what the table is saying is that A, there is a higher than expected number of farmers with no coal seam gas lease, or think they have no coal seam gas lease over their properties, in the non-stressed group. So that's probably unsurprising. So these people don't think they've got coal seam gas, and so there's a higher number of them in that non-stress group. But interestingly, there's a higher than expected number of farmers who've engaged with the coal seam gas industry who are in the CSG stress group. So these people have willingly engaged with the industry, and there's a higher than expected number of them within our coal seam gas group. And again, another one of these riveting slides. It details the reported depression, anxiety and stress reactivity levels of our profiles. The bottom line here is that neither the non-stressed or the finance stressed farmers as a group displayed clinical levels of any of the mental health outcomes. This contrasts with our coal seam gas stress farmers, who as a group reported mild levels of both depression and stress reactivity. Yes, those levels are mild. Yes, though, they are clinically significant, and yes, it is worrying. These are mean scores across the whole profile. So within these profiles, there are, of course, farmers who are not at all concerned, but there are farmers in the profiles who are spiking at the top end of the spectrum on all the mental health outcome measures. Is it solely because of coal seam gas? Well, of course it isn't. But the fact that we identified a coal seam gas stress profile of farmers and that the coal seam gas is a unique stressor suggests that coal seam gas is contributing to the poor mental health outcomes within these regional communities. Okay, we're on the home straight here now. So the take-home messages, essentially, farmers, CSG concerns related to the community and health impacts of CSG explain unique variants in depression and stress reactivity after we control for all the other common, usual agricultural stresses. Stress profiles can be created, providing an insight into how best to tailor and subsequently communicate messages and intervention information to these communities. Coal seam gas concerns also played a central role in 2 of the 4 farmer stress profile segments identified in our sample. Both of these segments exhibited clinically significant levels of psychological morbidity, albeit in that low to moderate region of severity. And finally, that there were a statistically higher number of farmers who have voluntarily engaged with the industry in the CSG stress profile, and this profile also reported clinically significant levels of depression and stress reactivity. And to finish up with, I always like this quote: for every difficult and complicated question, there is an answer that is simple, easily understood and usually wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.